Astrology, as we know it today, is considered to be a field of study that many deem to be a pseudoscience. Technically speaking, there is no scientific evidence to suggest its legitimacy in today's society. However, this was not always the case. There was once a time in history where many of the world's most advanced societies and civilizations firmly believed in what this field of study preached. But as time progressed and ideas started to drastically change, so too did the belief in astrology. What started out as a noble profession to study slowly turned into a subject that would go on to be criticized and mocked heavily by society. Today, many scholars and articles like to criticize this field of study, but I like to dedicate my essay to something different. I like to dedicate my essay to two periods in time that actually valued this practice, that being the ancient period and the Renaissance period, as I believe this is not discussed nearly as much as it should be. So without further ado, here's my pitch for my historiography-styled essay, Look to the Stars, a study of the golden age of astrology. Of course, if you're going to do a historiography-styled paper, you need to start at the beginning, or at least what society deems to be the beginning. In this case, I'd like to start with the creators of astrology, the Babylonians. If you're unfamiliar with who the Babylonians are, they were an ancient civilization that once existed during biblical times and were located where modern Iraq is now. There's a lot to be said about this ancient civilization, as they were quite advanced for their time. Not only were they one of the first societies to establish a code of law, specifically the Code of Hammurabi, but they also had a keen interest in stargazing, which eventually led to the creation of astrology. Astrology was very important to the Babylonians, and a great deal of their daily life and practices was derived from the study. So I've taken history courses at CBU for 5 years now, and I can only pinpoint one class first year that we briefly touched upon the Babylonians. So I was largely unfamiliar with this advanced society, aside from a few key minor details. So I figured the best place to start with this essay was to look for a standard Babylonian history textbook, and then maybe a mathematical studies on early astrology book. I first started with an online textbook that I found on Google Scholar by Luke Hodgkin on ancient mathematics, simply titled A History of Mathematics. I won't lie when I say that math has never been a strong suit of mine, so initially I had my doubts about this textbook. Thankfully, it's written in such a straightforward manner that it was quite easy to follow, and there's a lot of really great visuals in it too. I then found a very complex but informative book by Markham J. Geller on science, technology, and medicine in the ancient world. And as it would turn out, all three of these fields of studies greatly depended on a knowledge of astrology. What's great about this book is not only does it dive into ancient astrology, but it includes some very interesting translations of ancient accounts of astrology from tablets and how they would apply to medicine. Of course, with this being an ancient society, some accounts and tablet readings are rather bizarre to say the least, but to today's standards, they're also quite entertaining to read through. So that's the first section of my paper, which covers the ancient world in astrology. Now I want to move on to another period, and this period is when astrology was arguably at its all-time high in regards to who practiced it, that being the Renaissance period. This is a time in history when we're introduced to some of the most well-known scientists that have ever lived. Scientists like Kepler, Galileo, and even a French astrologer known as Nostradamus. So, when we tend to think of the term astrology, typically one or even three of these guys will usually pop up in the conversation. If you've taken any of Dr. Julia Rombo's classes, specifically Renaissance history, then this all may seem a bit familiar. The Renaissance was a period of rapid change in the world, in both art and literature, but also that consisted of ideas as well. The Renaissance period is an interesting period of time to study because It's a period of time that people often look to the past for guidance and inspiration, almost with a nostalgia like feeling. This, of course, would apply to many astrologers as well, such as the three I mentioned earlier, as many of them would look back to the Ptolemaic system for inspiration or critique. I think it's important to note that the astrology we're currently looking at in the Renaissance period is not the same type of astrology that existed in the ancient period that the Babylonians practiced. It is still the same thing and has the same basic structure, but by this point, with the Renaissance being thousands of years after the Babylonian Empire fell, ideas have changed, people have come and gone. So the paradigm is slowly starting to shift at this point, and there's much more critique, and there's much more agendas behind everything now, especially with the church and what science is, and does the church influence science? So that's important to take note of here as well. A great piece of scholarly work to consult for this is Brendan Dooley's A Companion to Astrology in the Renaissance, as well as Mary E. Weisner Hanks' Early Modern Europe, 1450 to 1789, which was the assigned textbook for Dr. Rombo's Renaissance class as well. All right, that pretty much wraps up my presentation for the most part. Please note that not all of my research has been done yet, pertaining to especially the ancient section, as a lot of it is quite complex. But this is essentially to serve as a quick pitch of my idea, rather than a polished presentation, I suppose. So just want to say thank you for taking the time to listen to me. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask, and I'll be happy to answer them. Thanks.